بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
You are not like other carbon-based life forms. You put the value of all life above your own.
Welcome to the second episode of the second season, Silent Messages, of the fourth podcast. I am Ali Wazir.
I am Ibrahim Ali. And I'm Talha Muhammad.
And you can help us grow by giving us a follow on Instagram at thefourth.productions and Twitter at thefourth_prod, P-R-O-D. Back to the show. So let's continue from where we left off last week.
Last week, we talked about empathy through the lens of current affairs. Specifically, we talked about empathizing with the working class. This week, we're going to talk about empathy through the lens of culture, specifically the desensitization of the effect of social media and media in general.
So the proliferation of social media in the last few decades has had positive impacts on humans. It unfortunately has had some negative impacts. Amongst them are the desensitization effects that it carries.
So what exactly is this desensitization effect that you talk about, Ali?
Well, desensitization for humans on, whether it be on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, or any other social media, happens to be in regards to any sort of current affairs, whether it be more recently issues with the Kashmir occupation and invasion, issues with the Brazilian rainforest being on fire, issues with warfare occurring in other countries across the globe. And we are constantly inundated with images of this warfare and this violence and this destruction. However, because we are so...
Maybe because we're getting these images every day on our social media.
Mm-hmm.
So I think social media is one aspect of it. We should also talk about, the traditional forms of media, like as in radio and cable news and that sort of
Who listens to radio anymore?
Yeah, man, what are you talking about?
I don't know.
Who reads the newspaper anymore?
I never said newspaper. Yeah, but
so maybe like social media and cable news, right?
Well,
is that the term?
I think you make a great point, Ibrahim. The only issue is I remember even being in middle school and high school, and professors and teachers would ask, does anyone read the newspaper? And I would be that one kid that would be like, yeah, I read the newspaper. I read the point section in the morning news. And I would be literally that one kid. So I would probably say it's more prevalent within social media than it is. I mean, no doubt you find these same images and the same news being spread in your traditional media outlets. You just don't see it in regards to, how do I say this? You don't see it on such a widespread scale.
So I think the difference between the way that we are desensitized to these events, there's a little bit of a difference between traditional media and new age media like social media. I think the way that they desensitize us from traditional media, right, from let's say like a big news company, right, is that they try to divert your attention from one topic to the other. And with social media, we see that there's a lot of quote unquote social media activism. I think that fulfills the ego of the people that are trying to, quote unquote, be woke or whatnot. We see it through when the protests were happening in Sudan. Everybody, changed their profile picture to blue, or when the occupation of Kashmir happened by India, everybody, changed it to red. So we need to really look and dissect why we do this.
You're totally right. Just before we head off onto social media activism, though, I think that we need to really consolidate what we're talking about when we talk about the desensitization effect of media. So just to be clear with you guys, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what we're specifically talking about today is the effect that the desensitization of media on us has on our empathy. Is that about correct? Like how the media desensitizing us every day by showing us regular graphic images and images of destruction, like you said, decreases our empathy for the people who are supposed to be benefiting from this exposure, actually.
Yeah, I think you're 100% correct on that. Because we see hundreds of videos and pictures of children in Palestine being killed by the soldiers of the illegal occupation, Palestine. You also see, remember a couple years ago, there was that refugee crisis We saw.
I think that's still ongoing. Right?
Yeah, it is still ongoing. Exactly, and that proves our point that we've been so desensitized to it. We saw pictures of children. You know that really viral picture that came out a while ago. It was like the child that washed up dead on the shore.
Yeah, on the
Yes,
trick or
yes.
short.
So things like that have truly desensitized us to these tragedies that go on every single day.
You know what's interesting is while we're talking in regards to empathy, we see major news corporations such as Fox News, for example, being founded in '96 by Rupert Murdoch. He also planned for legislation that allowed for news outlets to provide biased reporting. And what's interesting with that is you have individuals who solely watch Fox News or individuals who solely watch CNN, and they will stick to that news source without branching out. And that kind of leads to also a lack of empathy and also a sense of desensitization when discussing politics or discussing current affairs with other individuals. And I see this really prevalent, whether it be even with the concept of like nationalism, for example, amongst an international audience. But mainly here in America, you see it primarily dealing with the news outlets that individuals watch and how that affects them when they converse. So, you know, guys, one of the really important topics I'd like to bring about is the advent of news outlets, specifically traditional news outlets that Ibrahim, you were mentioning earlier. That influence can be derived from individuals like Rupert Murdoch in 1996 when he developed Fox News. And he actually planned for legislation that allowed for news outlets to provide very biased news reporting. And that's why, for example, you see Fox News being the way it is. You see some individuals claiming CNN to be very left-wing, and how that directly influences, number one, our desensitization, any sort of, news that we receive. It also affects directly how American culture perceives different political, both political sides. For example, we see the left wing as being extremely liberal, right? When someone talks to you about the left wing, the immediate assumption is you look at the very extreme side of it. And when someone mentions to you the right wing, the general American immediately assumes the most extreme side of it as well.
I think before we dive even deeper into it, I think that our political spectrum has been shifted right so much that the culture in America is that, they think that, I saw this picture the other day, some guy was saying that Obama is as left-wing as you can get, and I think that's the furthest from the truth.
I mean, the fact that people think Bernie Sanders is left-wing is problematic in and of itself.
So
right?
I think that this culture of, the topic of this episode is specifically culture. The way that, these traditional media corporations are owned by like 2 or 3 billionaires, right? Mm-hmm. And that they use this platform that they've built up over the years to pit these people against each other, even though it should be we should all be united in,
Yeah, we should all be united in empathizing with each other, for sure. So, if we look specifically on the effect that social media has on desensitizing us and alienating us from our culture, it's very profound. So we see both sides of the political spectrum that you mentioned using these kind of images excessively, right? And so say somebody wants to speak out about, like, against Assad in Syria. First thing they'll jump to is, like, they'll pick out some pictures from the Ghouta chemical attack, right? Like, people with their, like, horrific images, like people, their skins turned black and, mutilated corpses and all that kind of really graphic, horrific stuff. But the fact that they're jumping to that as a first resort, rather than save that for the last or not showing those images at all for the sake of decency. Now when you see those pictures, it doesn't affect you. And that really affects our culture. It also affects the video games we play. It affects how we see sports. It starts putting its fingers in all these other little pies.
So do you guys think that these public figureheads, these politicians, use these graphic images to, gain political points or, score political wins? Do you guys think that it's used to, again, further divide us?
I think that's true to a certain degree, although mainly I have to say it deals with the individuals that are within those spaces. For example, if you have a left-wing group or a right-wing group, you have, individuals that are part of those groups. And they attempt to just spam social media with a specific image. And Talha, you mentioned like very graphic images that depict specific instances in time, that in and of itself is more of an emotional response, in my opinion. I wouldn't necessarily say it's immediately someone taking this image and making it political, although you tend to see leaders immediately catching up to the social media storm and taking these images and making them very political. So, for example, the issue of the migrants at the border right now here in the United States. You have obviously few thousand people at the border living in essentially tent cities, and they're being denied access to the United States, whether they're Guatemalans, whether they're Mexicans, from any specific country. They are being denied access on the sole issue of whether or not they're safe to this country. Unfortunately,
quote unquote safe, I think, yeah.
And unfortunately, it leads to politicians in today's society that pick that up and attempt to, change laws and change the perspective of individuals by repeatedly tossing out these images and creating a certain narrative through these images.
You're right, man. Like you said, it's not always political either. So there's another aspect to the desensitization of our media, and I think part of it is a little bit more innocent, but it has the same impact maybe long term, which is like YouTube prank videos, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of them, people are actually getting hurt. I know most of the YouTubers who make these kind of videos, they target younger audiences. So kids who are 6, 7, 8, watching on their family's iPad, they're exposed to this kind of media. I think that decreases their empathy there as well from a very young age.
So I think a really good point that was brought up by someone I was listening to speaking earlier. He talked about how, simple cartoons like, Tom and Jerry and Pink Panther have a lot of, it's not very graphic, but there's a lot of gratuitous violence in these cartoons. Tom, gets cut up into several pieces multiple times. And so children get desensitized to violence, even though it's on a very small level. And I think we should be clear that, these cartoons and video games don't necessarily affect people. They might desensitize them, but
Wait, so what's your point right now? Are you speaking out against Tom and Jerry?
No, I'm just saying that we've been desensitized
through their subliminal messages.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if cartoons is the best example of this.
My boy Imam Siraj Wahaj, I think he mentioned this.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't know
I don't doubt you, although I haven't heard that before. But I think perhaps in very recent trends, like I said, prank videos, and I think that has a bigger effect on it just because you see people doing it too. A lot of times it's staged, but the kids wouldn't know that, right? They feel like it's somebody going up and doing it to a complete random stranger. And it has a much more real feel about it, in my opinion.
Yeah. So are you saying that, would you go as far to say that video games also desensitize people, like playing Modern Warfare or,
Perhaps, I'm not trying to sound like a suburban white mom right now.
Okay, Karen.
Yeah.
But maybe in excess of that might have that impact on somebody who's already leaning that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the problem with that is that it does desensitize everyone to a certain degree, right? But again, it's not the cause of of people, how they say that gun violence is caused by violence. I don't think we could take it to that extreme in any way, in any stretch of the imagination.
Wait, what do people say?
That gun violence is caused by violent video games. That was a big narrative after some of these.
No, that's not what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I'm trying to make that differentiation. I'm just saying that we become slightly desensitized to violence at a certain degree. Maybe for some people it's a lot more than others, and then for some people it's a lot less. But again, it's a case-by-case basis, and we have to make that differentiation.
Let's continue talking about social activism then, and how that adds on to this desensitization in our culture.
I think one great point that was mentioned by somebody I was hearing earlier is called clicktivism, where people are always looking for emotional gratification through the means of likes, retweets, follows, and whatnot. Maybe we could speak to how social activism and clicktivism are related.
So before you continue, please do subscribe to us on Instagram and Twitter. I need my daily dopamine hit.
One of the great points you just made, man, about clicktivism also happens to deal with the culture of individuals and specifically, as we discussed in season 1, the concept of nationalism. That in itself is so deep rooted within the culture of people that, for example, going back to the Kashmir and the Sudan issue that you mentioned previously, when the Sudan issue occurred, and this is obviously from my own experience and from my own personal experience, it happens to be that many of the individuals from the subcontinent didn't post too much about Sudan, or didn't change. You didn't see everyone really changing their icon to that blue color that everyone had attempted to spread around. And then when the Kashmir issue occurred, which is right in the heart of the subcontinent, you saw so many people from India, Pakistan, Kashmir change their icon to red. But then everyone from that that Sudan area or had anything related to Sudan kind of were leaving it alone a bit, and they didn't promote as much activism as they would have back with this Sudan issue.
So I think this, all stems from, again, like the theme of the season is empathy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it stems from a lack of empathy in between these two cultures or these two areas for each other. Mm-hmm. And I think that just manifests itself through social media. Like, we see the effect of that in a very visual manner through social media, and like how we observe interactions on there.
Yeah, now that the U.S. has supported a coup in Bolivia, you see even fewer people from, say, the subcontinent or the Arab world changing their profile pictures to the Wapala, right, in support of the legitimate president.
I'm sorry, man. Could you elaborate on that? Because I honestly have no clue what's going on down there.
So, this is recent happenings as we're recording this podcast anyway. But President in Bolivia, Evo Morales, he was reelected a couple months ago. He's been doing a lot of good for the country, especially for the country's indigenous population for many years now. But at the same time, he's kind of been snubbing the United States. Mm-hmm. So they decided that was it. They first tried to get a lot of protesters in Bolivia to protest against the guy. Nothing really came of that because most people in the country actually liked him. So eventually they ended up supporting the military, the CIA that is, ended up supporting the military as they kind of forced him and his vice president to leave the country. So he fled to Mexico. Wow. Mm-hmm. And very hardcore right-wing Christian nationalist has taken the presidency. And funny thing is, she's a woman. So, liberals in this country are trying to sell it as a woman's revolution. Mm-hmm. It's really not that. And now the military is actually out there beating protesters who came out now in favor of the deposed president, and they're cracking down on them. So a lot of Bolivians have asked people to show solidarity for the illegally deposed president by changing their profile picture to the Wapala, which is the indigenous people's flag in Bolivia. It's a nice little rainbow colored flag, but difference checkered. Don't think about it too hard.
So I think
that's totally off topic though.
So I think we can relate this back to empathy in another situation. Mm-hmm. We see social media playing a big part in this too. Is in China. Okay. We have the Uyghur Muslims being placed in internment camps, and nobody is talking about that. And we see the protests in Hong Kong getting so much light in the media, both traditional media and social media, on platforms like Reddit and Instagram and Twitter. And then there's little to no coverage of the Uyghur Muslims literally being ethnically cleansed in China. And I think that social media has a big part to play in this because, like we said, so, we didn't mention this before, but social media has it's a sort of herd mentality, right? Mm-hmm. If there's something that's, trending or something that's really popular, people will try to flock towards it, basically, right?
You're right. Yeah, go ahead.
With likes or, upvotes and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And they'll reach the front pages of these platforms while the real issues stay languishing behind in real life.
Yeah, so I know I'm kind of hating on social media activism, because a lot of it is actually meaningless. I couldn't help but smirk while hearing about changing your profile picture to red. I imagine somebody wakes up in the morning, oh, something happened in Kashmir, let me change my profile picture to red like all my friends are doing, and then sit back the rest of the day haha, yeah, I did something, But at the same time, it can't be underestimated, or this is not to say that we need to leave social media altogether, because in China, two very different things are going on. Like you mentioned, there's the Hong Kong protests going on, which are have a very right wing kind of vibe to them. In the first place, Hong Kongers, a lot of them unfortunately have a real colonized mentality, to go back to season 1 real quick, from being a British colony for like 99 years. Because of that, they feel superior to mainland Chinese people, right? They like look down upon them. So the protests in Hong Kong have a lot to do with that. And no one in Hong Kong has actually died because of like the protests or anything. Like everybody's doing fine in Hong Kong for the most part. And
meanwhile, we
right?
have...
and then on the other side, in Western China, there's like you mentioned, the Uyghur like the Uyghurs are actually being locked up in concentration camps, being forced to leave the religion, and actually being killed as well, right? Like there are actual deaths on that side. Like they're being starved to death in a lot of those camps as well. One clearly has a huge social media presence across all kinds of demographics, across like Europeans, Americans. Everybody right now knows about Hong Kong, and very few people know about the situation with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. And a lot of that has to do with just that the Hong Kongers have a good grasp on social media, I think, right?
So I think you mentioned one point in the beginning when you started talking about how you have a kind of cynical view towards social media activism. I actually kind of disagree with that, because I think that even though the intention may be flawed, because we all need that dopamine, if you know what I'm saying.
No, I think the intention is usually in the right place, but the
effect.
action, like the praxis itself, is not enough.
Yeah, but I think it definitely is not enough, but it's better than not doing it. I don't know if you know what I'm saying, because a lot of people kind of found out about the Sudan protests through people changing their profile picture to blue. I know it's not...
Do you have stats to back your claim?
Yeah,
Where's
the evidence, bro?
I think a lot of people learned about it after Hassan Minhaj did.
Actually, that's
right?
true, man.
Yeah.
I'm curious why he hasn't done anything on the Uyghur Muslims, though.
He's paid by Big China.
I don't know who owns Netflix. You need that Netflix sponsorship.
Oh, I am curious now that I think about it. I didn't think about it like that. He actually has never done anything on the Uyghur Muslims yet.
I don't know. I don't religiously watch his stuff, but
Get a little... Never mind.
But going back to...
But if you don't mind, what was your point about social media activism?
Disagree with Talha, but I mean, you can provide the evidence, but it's all good. I mean, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, we know you can't provide any evidence, but you can still continue.
I mean, what's your evidence for it not being effective?
I don't think that's the way evidence works.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna leave.
Yeah. So, I mean, my point was that it's better than nothing. You know what I'm saying?
You know what's interesting, man? I understand your point where you said it's better than nothing, and Talha is on the other spectrum saying
that it is nothing.
It's essentially useless to a certain degree. Yeah, you do bring awareness to the issue. However, I feel as though more can be done. Like, why is it that, for example, Uyghur Muslims and individuals in Kashmir or people in Sudan have to essentially beg for other people to care? That in itself just shows a lack of empathy within human civilization, especially here in the West, here in America, where other countries have to beg and ask for, whether it be monetary aid, whether it be food, whether it be assistance in war zones.
Or asylum.
Yeah, or asylum.
I think this ties very well back into our previous episode, right?
Yeah.
Episode 1, where we talked about the ruling class. And I think this is the effect of the way that sow the seeds of difference, I don't know what the word would be, like of...
sectarian division?
Yeah, something like that. How they sow the seeds of division in between us. They make us, they always have the enemy, right? The other person. They don't want people coming into this country because they're immigrants, or they always otherize any certain demographic. You saw that this was done with the Japanese during World War II, or black people during the 80s under Reagan. And now it's beginning to happen to us, Muslims. We need to bring a greater level of awareness amongst ourselves and actually do some real things for change, real activism, not just clicktivism.
All right, so I'm going to put you two on the spotlight really quick then.
Of course, go ahead.
If social media activism is not enough, then what are actual ways that we can increase empathy within our culture and reduce the impact of desensitization that social media has?
Well, number one is being able to bring awareness in a physical sense. Going through people's Instagram stories, you can literally swipe through at least 15 in a matter of seconds if you wanted to.
Okay.
Let's be honest, you can, right? However, if you, us being, for example, or our audience being a college age individual or high school age individual, or even if you're in the working, if you're working, you can go out and sit down and have a conversation with individuals about, hey, yo, have you heard about this? Or perhaps you could form a club on your campus, or you could form a club in your high school and talk about the issues that are occurring to individuals, individuals across the world on like a day-to-day basis. For example, one of the organizations that comes to my mind is SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine. And this is just as Talha, you were asking for examples how we can actually spread empathy and awareness in society. They're actually doing a great job right now. They're holding booths. They're protesting. I remember one of the individuals. I'm not going to name it, but he's very active when it comes to raising awareness, whether it be in Kashmir, whether it be in Palestine, and he holds these protests on the student union at the university, which is like the major hub where everyone goes for like food and everyone goes to just hang out. So yeah.
I think another way we can also increase awareness is through real research, getting to know the facts about what's going on, not just following again what's trending, and going and really finding out what's actually going on in the world. Not just looking at these short 5 to 10 minute videos or anything like that. We should be doing like actual solid, impactful research.
What's also interesting, man, is eventually I would like for society to provide a non-biased news outlet by which individuals.
Whoa! The fourth news productions.
So eventually, a non-biased.
No, we're gonna be
outlet,
biased,
right?
Is that going in?
We'll see.
Because, I mean, as if you guys remember, and our listeners remember from our last season, the last episode, you have to begin the conversation, right? You have to talk about these things openly and willingly.
I think.
Yeah, in the words of Ustad Isa, you gotta crack some eggs to make the omelet.
And I
Exactly.
think that's the main point of this podcast, right? I mean, we're by no means any like subject matter experts on this.
Mm-hmm.
We're just trying to have conversations about things that we're passionate about or that we think that matter.
So let's converse more about the impact that it has on our culture then. We're talking about collectivism, we're talking about, the desensitization really that comes from there.
Well, back to collectivism and, not necessarily collectivism, but rather cultural aspects of this. Well, in regards to culture, I'd like to take it back to nationalism. So how much does the colonized mindset play a role in how we perceive empathy towards other individuals? Because as you both mentioned, with the migrant crisis, for example, why do so many Americans view these migrants as being rapists, thugs, murderers, killers? Because that's just literally what they've been fed through
By
news
Ronald
outlets.
Reagan.
So
You're not wrong.
So we have to take a broader look and recognize that, hey, at the end of the day, these are human beings. You need to do something to better their lives or better the human population in general.
I totally agree, man. Like that nationalist culture that you're talking about, that's been developed, and like each country tries and develops it further. It really hampers from the humanity within us, right? It desensitizes us. So I know we touched upon this last season as well.
Even last episode we talked about Medicare for all and like healthcare, and how one common argument is that I don't want to pay for the healthcare of another individual,
Of an alien.
something like that.
Yeah.
So I think that again is a lack of empathy, like you said, that's brought on by.
And then all those GoFundMes don't help either.
Yeah,
You know.
it's brought on by.
Why not? Whoa, I'm sorry. I have to, why do you say that these GoFundMes do not?
Like the GoFundMes for medical conditions, Because the thing is, like, you can open GoFundMe.com, whatever it is. Maybe it's .org. I wouldn't know. But
Try not to get sued, please.
you can just, like, scroll through myriads of people who have different medical conditions that they're going through, right? So that's a big part of desensitization over there. So I'm sure if somebody has like $5 extra to donate, then they like start going through it, like, this person just has thyroid cancer, I don't really care too much, I'm looking for somebody with like kidney dialysis right now, like that's desensitization, right? Like shouldn't we care about everybody? I don't know.
Or like fundamentally change the system that allows these inequalities to exist.
That's the goal, G.
Yeah.
So how do we go about changing that system that allows for these inequalities to exist?
I mean, like you said, man, it starts with the small things. You gotta start this conversation with
You
different
gotta love
people.
for your neighbor or love for your brother or sister what you love for yourself. I mean, bring back to like really core principles. We should be willing to step up and help out somebody else at expense of our own comfort and our own luxuries. That if you cut back on, I don't know, just some of the basic quote unquote luxuries in life, in order to help out another individual, and I think just on an individual basis, we can make a small change by having empathy for people who need help.
And I think going back to the concept of nationalism, I think our generation has this ability to effectively tone it down, if not abolish it entirely. And the reason why I say that is because you have so many individuals attempting to or wanting to live their lives by, as Ibrahim, you mentioned, loving for their brother or sister what they love for themselves. And that removes so many walls and barriers. You no longer look at an individual as, oh, this guy is not the same skin color as me. He's not the same race or ethnicity as me. Oh, he doesn't come from the same country as me. Because especially when it comes to empathy, you don't look at those qualities. You just recognize, from heart to heart, it's a human being. I've got to, and you try and establish the morals and ethics of a society based on what is, going to benefit everyone. But as we've seen, if you just take a dive into recent history, for example, we looked at the Japanese internment camps post-World War II in the 1940s. We looked at Jim Crow laws. We've also looked at, the Black Lives Matter movement more recently, right? Or we haven't taken a look at that specifically, but this is just also something that has to do with empathy towards a specific race or culture. For example, Black Lives Matter. Why do we have to? Human beings in general, I understand that. No, I understand the history. Don't get me wrong. I understand the history and the oppression. And I attempt to empathize with that to the best of my ability. I also recognize that it needs to be done so on such a broader scale to where, as Americans, you not only recognize that, hey, Jews were prosecuted, in their camps during World War II with Hitler, or that African Americans underwent this sort of oppression, but also now you're able to look at those and learn from it and apply it to the Uyghur Muslims, right? Who are Chinese Muslims, completely different race, ethnicity, completely different culture. But hey, they're still undergoing some issues. The individuals in Bolivia, as you mentioned, they're still undergoing issues when it comes to warfare and government turmoil. The individuals in Syria, they're undergoing similar issues when it comes to warfare and turmoil as well. So I just feel as though, yes, you do, to a certain degree, you can focus on the race and culture to a certain degree. But from a broader perspective, at least in my opinion, I would like to remove those, what I consider to be roadblocks, in order to just care about the overall human condition.
You're totally right, man. Yeah. And I do have high hopes for our generation. I'm glad already that nationalist has a negative connotation, one that it didn't have in the last century. I see that as a step in the positive direction. Now, people still think patriotic, a good term to be described by, one step at a time, hopefully. But, I do see a positive development in our generation, and perhaps a shyness, not shyness in the common sense, but like pulling away, perhaps.
We say a reluctance to...
Yes, a reluctance to buy into like stuff that we see on media, like in the media and on social media, as easily.
So I think we should wrap it up with this point. And I mean, personally, I think that greater level of awareness via our own research, and I think we can bring around a greater level of empathy in general in our society.
Thank you all for tuning in to the Fourth Podcast. Again, be sure to give us a follow on Instagram at thefourth.productions and Twitter at thefourth_prod, PROD. And be sure to tune in again next week where we will talk about empathy and wellness. As of now, we hope you have a great rest of your week.